Hello, everybody. This is the beginning of the workshop on Raptors and energy infrastructure, and I think we all know that wind energy is growing dramatically throughout the world, and there are many potential conflicts with wind turbines and wildlife, especially flying wildlife, and especially birds, soaring birds. And so this is a really appropriate topic for a meeting like this focused on raptors, and it's an important opportunity for us to talk about wind energy and its interactions with birds of prey. So we have 4 or 5 talks today. Several of them will be by myself and Jill Shaffer from the U.S. Geological Survey in the USA. We have a talk from Spain and maybe one other. We will see. But without further ado, let's get started. The first presentation will be by Jill Shaffer from the U.S. Geological Survey in North Dakota, USA. And Jill will be introducing a lecture series that she and I are preparing with the support of the U.S. Embassy here in Kazakhstan. And well, take it away, Jill.
Good afternoon. My name is Jill Shaffer. I am here with Todd Katzner as Embassy Science Fellows and as biologists from the United States Department of the Interior. Combined, Todd and I have several decades of experience researching the effect of wind energy facilities on birds. The Association for the Conservation of Biodiversity worked with the U.S. Embassy in Astana to bring us here today to share our expertise. And the vehicle that they used to bring us here is called the Embassy Science Fellows Program that is administered by the U.S. Department of State. And that program draws on the expertise of U.S. government scientists to share their expertise with foreign countries. So Todd, the goal for Todd and myself is to share our expertise on the effects of wind energy development on scientists and government regulators within Kazakhstan, and that could include people from the government, university, independent researchers, or organizations from civil societies like ASPICA. So what Todd and I did for our fellowship was to develop a lecture series. There are 8 parts or 8 lectures to this series. This is considered lecture number 1. It is the only in-person lecture. All of the remaining 7 will be available via Zoom. So as you can see on this slide, some of the topics, and I'm going to go into each of these topics in a little bit more detail here in a bit. So just basically, we're going to address the basic main topics that people that investigate the impacts of wind energy facilities deal with. How to conduct pre-construction surveys for birds and bats, how to conduct post-construction surveys, how to mitigate, what are the policy and regulatory aspects, and then Todd and I will sum up the lecture series. So to begin with the first lecture here today, we're going to start with, why should we as a society care about this growing development on the Kazakh landscape, and that is the nascent industry of wind energy development. We're going to introduce some of the basic concepts that those of us that investigate this field use amongst ourselves. And in so doing, we'll present some case studies that we think will really drive home those concepts and that will be of interest to most people, including using the golden eagle as a case study. So first, we'd like to draw some comparisons between wind energy development in Kazakhstan and in the United States. So as of 2021, the United States produced about 133 gigawatts of energy through wind energy. And as you can see, that trend of production is going upwards. Likewise, in Kazakhstan, we also see an upward trend. And although Kazakhstan's not quite to that 133 gigawatt mark, it is expected that it could realistically get there. When we look at the global capacity of the two countries, we will note that they have similar capacity. So this scale here, the warm colors, the yellows, oranges, and reds are the highest global capacity for onshore wind. We're talking about onshore wind here, whereas the blue shades indicate the lowest capacity. So you will note that large swaths of the central United States and, you know, kind of the steppe and other areas of Kazakhstan are in that higher global capacity. Other similarities that the two countries share is that they both have very important bird migratory flyways that traverse their countries, our countries. And so we suspect that as we have found negative impacts to migratory birds in the United States, that Kazakhstan may also start exhibiting negative impacts to migratory birds. An avenue for future research for sure, but just based on what we've seen in the United States, we suspect that may be the case. So we'll begin here with some of the major issues that we talk about with the impact of wind energy facility on birds and on bats. And one of the first is habitat alterations or habitat changes. And what we're referring to here is more of a behavioral avoidance. Sometimes it's referred to as displacement issue, where birds have been found to have lower breeding bird density near turbines than far from turbines. So the habitat per se under turbines may not have changed, but the birds are avoiding breeding there. So in a sense, that's altered the availability of that habitat for them to breed. Of course, mortality is probably the factor that most people think of when they think of the effects of wind energy facilities on birds and bats. And of course, it is a very major issue. We'll talk about some of those rates that we know we're experiencing in the US here in the next slide. And then finally, or not finally, but another concern that is in concert with the effects of mortality is what are the population level effects on birds and bats. One thing that we want you to keep in mind when we're talking about wind and the impact is that in many cases, especially say with the avoidance issue, we don't know what aspect of the wind facility is actually causing avoidance. It could be the turbine itself, the presence of the turbine itself. It could be the presence of all these new roads on the landscape. It could be the vehicular, the introduction of vehicular motion and maintenance workers. And another fact to keep in mind when we're talking about mortality, just remember that some of the older studies were based on older kind of the prototype of wind turbines, and most of those have been replaced by newer models. So if you're reading older literature and it's talking about these high mortality rates for Raptors, just kind of look what year was it written and is it referring to turbines that may no longer even be on the landscape. So to drive that home, we have an image here of an old, one of the newer models, so the oldest turbines now on the landscape, the lattice type structures, the shorter models, shorter blades, most of these have been replaced. So this is an image from Altamont Pass in California. I suspect that being, Raptor experts, of the notoriety accompanying Altamont Pass and the very high mortality rates associated with those older lattice type structures. Of course, now those have been replaced with these much newer models. It's not that these newer models don't create mortality. It's just that there are ways to mitigate now that we're aware of that we weren't before. So keep that in mind, the date of the literature that you're examining. So going back to the issue of habitat alteration, with and addressing the issue of bats. So the issue with tree roosting bats is all of a sudden there's this tall structure on the landscape that wasn't there before, and scientists believe that they're prospecting for roosting sites, or they think it's a tree, and in so doing they're hitting the blades and dying. So that's affecting their behavior. With ground nesting birds, as I alluded to before, the issue is a difference in breeding bird density. Sometimes there's an issue in the frequency of vocalizations, like with grouse. There's differences in how loud they boom and how often they cackle and things like that. But it's mostly a behavioral issue. We also know from studies that these turbines can affect the microclimate underneath the turbines. They can cause some desiccation. They can cause some minor, changes in the weather that affect vegetation, that therefore then could affect birds and whether they, the vegetation is suitable for them to breed under. And finally, the final issue is habitat fragmentation, especially when we're talking about grassland birds. We know from years of studies now that many species require these open, contiguous expanses of grassland or steppe. And without that contiguity, they won't nest there, or they have lowered reproductive success, or what have you. So these wind facilities are creating habitat fragmentation that we suspect will have an impact on those birds that we call area sensitive, that require these large, landscapes of contiguous habitat. So this is an image of a wind farm in the state of Wyoming. And you can see that the fragmentation is not caused so much by the turbines as it is by that network of rows. Okay, so very noticeable pattern changing the landscape. And of course, there's issues associated with potentially increased depredation as things like foxes use those roads for easy traversing the grassland, and that could affect nest success. So in terms of mortality or fatality, there are some taxa that we suspect are more susceptible to collisions with wind turbines. Those, of course, include the raptors. But we're finding that other species, and I think an earlier person alluded, maybe it was JD, that said when they do these power line inspections or these electrical inspections, they're finding a lot of different species of birds. If you look, you find them, right? You find the passerines, you find the raptors. So I think we're just beginning to get a sense of how the breadth of taxa that are impacted by mortality. One group of birds that we're not so worried about mortality are the grouse, what you would call your steppe grouse, what we call our grassland birds. They're not migratory, so they're not getting high up in the airway and flying long distances. They also have a breeding display that's very low to the ground. They boom and dance and cackle, but they don't have these skylarking behaviors. So we're not so worried with steppe grouse and mortality. The issue with them is avoidance. With tree roosting and colonial bats, we are concerned about mortality and them hitting the blades as they're checking turbines, whether there's higher insect concentration or what have you. But quite a few different species of bats are being hit by these turbine blades. And then the issue with some species like cranes and pelicans, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself from an earlier presentation, but we do know that species of cranes, the highest mortality factor for them is hitting electrical power lines. And of course, more wind energy facilities are associated with more power lines on the landscape. So we suspect that sandhill cranes, whooping cranes, perhaps your demoiselle cranes will be impacted. So there have been a few studies, some researchers that have tried to estimate what the rate of mortality for these species are. And, you know, it's a broad estimate. Most of them are quite dated now, 10 years old or so. They're only interested in the land-based birds at this point. And the range, you see that range there of 230 to 600,000 birds per year. You know, why is that range so large? Well, you're talking multiple taxa and a wide geographical range. Some scientists have tried to parse that down by different taxa and different regions, but the best estimate at this point, and it's very rough, it's like an average of an average, right? Like this overall is 1 to 50 fatalities per megawatt per year. Again, grouse, the rate's low because again, they're not migratory. And and then with bats, this is the best estimate that we have. It's 10 years old of how many the fatality rate for bats. So effects on populations, if we're still tentative about the mortality rates of birds and bats, we're even more tentative about what the actual effect on population demographics are. But some people have attempted this, including Todd over there. He suspects that golden eagles may be affected at a population level. And he and his, I think postdoc, I'm not Tara, I think she's a postdoc. They have also published work looking at 23 bird species in the state of California and suspect that at least half of those species are experiencing population level effects due to wind energy facilities. Another researcher has done some modeling based on a number of different studies, kind of like a meta-analysis, and they have highlighted the greater sage grouse and the greater prairie chicken as being in peril of being affected at a population level by wind energy facilities. We know of one study that's tried to examine population level effects for bats, and so that's an issue ripe for further research. So that's what we know. There's many more things we don't know. There are many limits to our understanding, including, you know, counting fatalities is not easy. There are a number of factors about detection and searcher efficiency and those things, which this lecture series will address in more depth in the months to come. There are best practices that are suggested, but they're not always used, and they're not always used consistently among facilities and among regions, as are not field techniques. So that makes comparing studies you know, amongst and between themselves very, very difficult. Another issue is that wind energy companies and environmental consulting firms may do loads and loads of studies, many studies, but they don't make them public. Okay, so that doesn't benefit society. The data are there, but they're not available to us. So that brings us back to this lecture series and the topics that we will address. So let's go into each of these topics in a little bit of detail. So the lecture that will occur in about 3 weeks, about mid-October, is going to address pre-construction surveys for birds. And it will discuss things like what are the typical techniques for counting individuals, you know, point counts or transects for birds, different types of counts for bats, and what are the pros and cons of those. And then we'll talk about, we do pre-construction surveys and we do post-construction surveys, but are they in agreement? Like, are they the ideal studies for each aspect of building and operating a wind farm? So we'll talk about the pros and cons of the current methodologies and how they can be improved upon. So that's going to occur, I think it's like October 13th through 16th. We haven't picked an exact date, but it's coming up next month. The next lecture, I skipped one. Let's see. There should be one on bats in here. I don't know where that one went, but there is a lecture on just pre-construction surveys for bats. I guess it was probably integrated into the previous slide. So that's a completely separate lecture 3. Lecture 4 will address post-construction surveys. This is where we'll discuss experimental design for those surveys, how to make those statistically robust. What is the best way to estimate detection rates, estimate searcher efficiency and scavenger removal? Can we have this concerted push to standardize across companies and facilities so that the data can be used in a meta-analysis or, you know, used at a greater level than just an individual facility level? And this lecture will, so how can we make pre and post construction surveys more fluid? Here's an example of a dog and a human looking for dead birds and bats underneath wind turbines. This will be one of the techniques that will be discussed and the advantages it has over humans alone, as well as, you know, drawing in how do you examine searcher efficiency. The next lecture will examine detection rates, and this will use the tool GenEst. So this lecture will be more of a workshop. So if you've ever been curious about what GenEst is and how to implement it, this is probably going to be the most hands-on workshop that we'll have in the lecture series. The next lecture is addressing mitigation. What can we do to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the effects of wind energy facilities on birds and bats? And there are numerous minimization options. Those will be addressed by Tabor Allison, as will mitigation. And I'm going to gloss over this here because there's more on this in a few slides. The second to the last lecture addresses regulatory and policy considerations. So, you know, what have we adopted in the US? How well has it worked? What could be done better? How can Kazakhstan just start off right away doing it even better? And so, you know, a bit about the philosophy and approach to writing regulations. I will be addressing this in my next talk in, I don't know what, half hour here, about the regulations for bald and golden eagles too. So. And then we'll wrap this up. Todd and I will wrap up this 8-part lecture series in March of 2024. And we'll talk about best management practices, tested solutions, ways to get Kazakhstan from you know, right from the start, doing things better than the US has done. That would be our gold standard goal. We hope to make this interactive and interesting and really relevant. So we'll be using case studies like, you know, issues with the golden eagle, kind of following that hierarchy of the lectures, pre-construction surveys for golden eagles, post-construction surveys, what's used, what could be done better. And if a company knows they could be doing better or they're not following the law, what happens? And so we'll be highlighting that situation, in particular, the first wind facility that it got prosecuted for violation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, got fined $1 million, which I believe is like 400 million tenge or something like that. And so that's a pretty hefty fine for a wind energy facility. I think it was a wake-up call that, you know, there are policies and regulations on the books for a reason. So what are the ramifications of not following the policies? Likewise, we'll do that in concert with BATS and pre-construction surveys, post-construction surveys, mitigation, best management practices. And then what happens if the wind energy companies don't follow best management practices and the law? You know, they will be prosecuted. So with that, I hope I have imparted to you that The wind and wildlife interplay is important. There are impacts, there are very serious known impacts, but the most egregious ones can be addressed. There are mitigation options to do that. And so here is the timeline with actual months in there for each of the topics. And you'll note that, as I had alluded to earlier, this is the first lecture and the only in-person one. All of the rest are virtual via Zoom. You're all welcome to join, the more the merrier. And it will end in March of 2024. So with that, if you have any questions, feel free to grab Todd or I at this meeting or email us. We do have a list of references that I used in this PowerPoint. So if, I know I flashed like Katzner and Conkling and Allison, all those papers flashed before your eyes. We have a PDF that we can send you that have those complete references in them. So with that, I guess if there's time for questions or if we're taking questions, I'll be happy to address them.
Thanks, Jill. I think we have time for one or two questions if people have any.
Yes. Yeah, you.
You would say the dog searching is standardized. Is there any standard, official standard that helps people in the search with dogs to do the job?
So I believe the question is, are there standardized practices for searching using dogs, right? And Todd's shaking his head no.
There has been some research, but there are not standardized practices for humans either. So, and the dogs are much better than the humans, usually.
Yes, sir.
Can you share a link for
To repeat that, please. The Zoom? Not yet, right, Todd? Yeah, contact Todd or I that you're interested and we'll make sure you get the link. And unless, is there a particular institution? Maybe we can share it through the group WhatsApp.
Yeah, I think we can do that, and we can make sure an email goes to everybody who attends this conference also. And then for those of you in Kazakhstan, I think both ACBK, ASBK, and the U.S. Embassy will be advertising this.
Yeah, I'm talking for the Raptor MOU, so I'm thinking actually to expand to the signatories, because this is very crucial and is very interesting for many, many countries, not only in Central Asia, but across. But I just want to understand how much is focus on Central Asia or whatever.
How much of the lecture content is focused? Most of our speakers, all of our speakers are North American. They're from the United States. They're going to focus on what they know. Right. So yeah, so it'll be US based, but I mean, Todd, that's maybe something we need to think about.
Yeah, I think the goal is to share the experiences that we have had in hopes that Kazakhstan can do better than we have done. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question from the chat.
Yeah, the question comes from Tosi Subedi from Nepal, and he asks, could you please suggest the best method for the estimation of carcass removal rate?
Which rate?
Carcass removal rate.
Carcass removal rate. The best method?
Correct.
The best method to estimate it.
Well, the day before Todd and I got on a plane, a best practices handbook got released from a bank. Which bank was it, Todd? An international, what? Yes. We have not had time to peruse that document, so they might suggest something. We need to look at that, but Todd might be able to address off the top of his head a
yeah.
better answer to that question.
I think the main point is that you need to do experiments. You need to put carcasses on the landscape and measure how long they last, but also you need to measure searcher efficiency.
Is there a document that lays any of that out yet?
I think that the Gen S stuff might.
Okay, sir. You in front here, second row. Oh.
I think, yes, as my friend said here, yes, the PCFM handbook that was released by IFC has a lot of the details because it's a best practice book. So it talks about post-construction fatality monitoring, including the bias correction trials and everything else. Janus has a part in it, big
Excellent.
appendix. So it's I think it's a very good reference book that we've been waiting for a very long time. So.
Yes, so the gentleman is just reiterating that that best practices handbook was just released. It's available, it is available right now. It was just released last week and he apparently has had time to digest it. So, but he suggests that if you're interested in, you know, the issue of curtailment, that would be a good resource.
And can that be shared with the WhatsApp group? Yeah. Because that might be really useful. If you can share that with the WhatsApp group, that's
Well, we
fantastic.
have it too, Todd. I put it on my tablet to read on the airplane, but that didn't happen, so. I was sleeping. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned that you do pre-construction surveys and post-construction surveys. Aren't such a project considered as a larger scale project, and don't they need a EIA report?
I'm not sure. So you're asking pre-construction surveys, post-construction surveys, they require a report, like an environmental consulting firm that does those needs to write a report
Yes, for government.
for the government.
Yes.
Not necessarily. Wind energy, a developer could contract with an environmental consulting firm to do those surveys and write that report that stays in-house. The developer could choose to share it and may need to share it if they're looking for a permit, say for take of an animal. But I don't believe they're required to share the report publicly.
I think this is a really important point that highlights every country has different rules, and then sometimes within countries, the rules are different. So I know that in the USA, if a wind facility is on private land, then they do not need to do a report. If it's on land owned by the government, usually they need to do a report. If it's on government land, it depends who owns the land as to whether the report is public or private. And so that's the USA. I know the rules are different in Europe, in Canada, probably everywhere. And so I think one of the issues to address is making some of these reports available in places where they are not, but also standardizing techniques. I think we have a comment from the chat, and then we should probably move to the next speakers.
Yeah, we have one more commentary, and it comes from Israel, from Ohad, who says that in Israel it's mandatory to use dogs in all wind farms, and now also in a solar tower facility. And he also refers to Asaf, who could give much more details at the spot here. So welcome to ask questions to Asaf.
Well, thank you for your interest. And remember, you can grab Todd and I, and we'll take your name and get you on the Zoom link, or keep reading your WhatsApp.
Thanks, Jill.